What's going on, guys? It is the Awesemo FanUp Strategy Show, and we've got some stuff to talk about here because FanUp, if you guys aren't familiar with it, different way to play daily fantasy sports. There's no salary cap here. You play whoever you want, and we're going to be going through some of the top overall plays. As you can see what's on the screen right here, producer Tyler sharing the app on the screen, how we're going to be filling out our lineups. You pick 2 guards, 2 forwards, 1 center, and a flex spot. The flex spot gets 1.5x their fantasy points. If you guys watched any of the football fan up shows we did, same idea in terms of the flex spot. Also, something you guys should be taking advantage of. If you sign up at FanUp for the first time, use the promo code Awesemo. You get $25 in your account that you could use for contest, 2,000 bonus points, and free. You don't have to make any deposit. You just have to download the app, sign up using the promo code Awesemo, and get some money to play with over there. So, Terry, we're going to be walking through these positions, and we don't have to worry too much about what the salary cap is or ownership or anything like that, because just the way this is structured, I think we're just kind of looking at who are the top overall projected players. And starting with some of the guards here, let's look at these players. And the first thing I think we have to discuss, Luka Doncic, by far the top projected guard on this slate. I have him projected for, let's see, like 20 more fantasy points than the next highest projected guard today. There aren't that many guys that are that close to him. There's LaMelo, who I have for the second most fantasy points, but there's a pretty big gap between what we view Luka as a fantasy producer compared to LaMelo Ball, which is not meant to degrade. I love LaMelo. Luka's a better fantasy player. We're all going to agree with that. If you look at the salary difference between them on FanDuel, DK, it's LaMelo by a mile. If salary cap is not an issue here, Luka is going to be the guy. Do you have any kind of pushback here? Are we playing LaMelo at guard, or is the only thing like, hey, we want to consider him for the flex spot?
Luka, you mean, right?
I said, yeah, Luka.
Yeah. I think that's the only decision point with Luka. Like, he's got to obviously be in this lineup in one spot or the other. And I think he's one of the few guys from the top of the board that it makes sense. We're just kind of looking at that short list of guys at the very top of the board. As far as one of these guys is going into that multiplier spot, we're going to roster all of them. Which one is it going to be in the multiplier spot? If we're looking at the other site projections that we've got up on the site, like using DK, we've got 3 guys, Joel Embiid, Giannis, and Luka, projected above 50 points. One of those guys is going in the flex spot in my mind, and then we build everything else. There's a much broader range of guys that are projected in like the 40s and the 30s that you can make some decision points on. But I think all 3 of those guys go in, and then we're just deciding which one of those 3 goes into the flex.
And then does the depth of a position matter to you when we're considering who to play in the flex spot? When we talked about the Super Bowl contest, for instance, we decided like, okay, we can't even play a running back or a tight end in the flex spot because then we just have to play an additional one of those guys at the tight end or the running back position. There just weren't that many options to choose from. Like, I look at forward today, that's a much deeper position than what we have at guard. Center, also a much deeper position. So do you think the opportunity cost at guard of playing Luka in the flex spot, is that a little bit too steep? Because if you go back over to the guard players that we have to choose from, there's Luka, there's LaMelo, and then the next highest projected guard I have for today is actually Reggie Jackson right now. So part of me just kind of wants to say like, hey, I'm going to get Luka, LaMelo, and then I'll consider somebody else at the flex spot. Who are the other guards that are really projected highly for you tonight?
Yeah, so I mean, just looking at where we've got it on the site's projections, it is LaMelo that comes up as the next most important guy. And I think with him in your pocket there, that's kind of just fine. Like, if you want to go to Luka, I don't see that much of a downgrade between in that next tier of guys. It's like a LaMelo. Then at forward, you can get Jimmy Butler projected in that range, or you can get Kyle Kuzma projected in that range. At center, you can get to a few different guys that are all, we've got a few guys that are projected high 30s, low 40s that are all coming out basically the same. So I think the theory that you're chasing there is definitely correct. And on a different slate, it might be more impactful, and it probably would rotate around the center position, I would think. But on this slate, I just think we've got options at every position where we need them, that we don't really need to sweat it very much.
Yeah. So I think we could look at these guys in tiers at guard. Luka, tier 1. LaMelo, tier 2. Same page so far?
Yep.
And then who do you view as the next tier of players that we would start to consider at the guard position?
So let's see. We've got CJ on the board. I think we can always expect there's a chance that CJ cracks through for a big 50-point type outing. We've got him projected at 35.9. It's a little bit lower than you mentioned Reggie Jackson before. We've got him at 37.8. But if I'm thinking about chasing just sheer upside and taking salary out of the equation, I think CJ's got a bigger ceiling than Reggie Jackson on any given slate. So I'd probably rank him above Reggie Jackson if we're looking at it like that. You can go down the list. The next, if we're just going through the list on FanUp here, we've got like Terry Rozier on the board at guard, Drew Holiday's on the boards, Jalen Brunson, if you wanted to go back to Dallas, there is on the board. But none of these guys are going to project out as well as those top few options.
So something that I don't know if you picked this up while you're talking, but Tyler's inability to spell CJ was quite entertaining for me because I see Tyler trying to type it in and I want to just point at my screen like the Leonardo DiCaprio meme where I'm just like, there it is. It's right there because it's on the screen in front of him, but he's it's like the second name on the screen, but he's trying to spell CJ and it's C.J. but he's just putting in CJ. So nothing's coming up. And I could see Tyler with the way that the screen share works where he just gave up trying to spell CJ halfway through. But yeah, you're right there. You could try Tyler. There's a couple ways to go. You could either spell CJ or you could do McCollum. Either of them work. But
at least he didn't go like SEEJAY or something like that. Like the guy who spelled Giannis YANUS in the strategy show this morning in chat. So it's the second worst name mistake I've seen today.
I don't know. Not being able to spell CJ is pretty bad.
That's pretty egregious.
I know that Tyler was hoping that nobody would see it, but there was no way that was getting past me. That's what I'm paying attention to. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on everything that Tyler types in there. Are there any guards that are kind of off the board for you that you think could potentially have a lot of upside? I mentioned for me, it's Reggie Jackson. Really positive matchup against the Houston Rockets. And the other thing, too, is just the situation with the Los Angeles Clippers. No Paul George for an extended period of time. Kawhi Leonard hasn't played this year, isn't expected to. And at the trade deadline to try to bolster their depth, the Clippers went out and they added Norman Powell. He plays a couple games where the team breaks his foot. I mean, the team's just cursed with injuries this year. Now you start to look at this team being really shorthanded and look at the workload for Reggie Jackson the last 3 games. 40 minutes, 38 minutes, 37 minutes. Last game, 33% usage rate, took 26 shots from the field. So if I'm looking to take somebody who's maybe a little bit off the board with upside and trying to really differentiate, I'll go with Reggie Jackson here at guard. Does that make sense for you? Is there anybody else you think maybe people won't be able to find? Maybe there's, maybe people can't spell CJ correctly. They're looking for somebody else. Who is there anybody off the board a la Reggie Jackson for you?
I mean, I think Reggie does make sense just, based on where we've got him in terms of that median projection. But, to me, he's already basically capping out if he's hitting, like a 37, 40-ish kind of a fantasy score here. That's around where we've got him projected. I don't see him cracking through to a much, much bigger ceiling where a guy like CJ, I think, has that 50-point upside. I think it's a lot fewer if we run this slate 100 times. I think Reggie's getting there a lot less often than CJ gets there. So I'm just looking at guys like that. I'm looking at guys who I think can reliably get to a 50-point upside, like a Terry Rozier. I have more faith in getting to that mark. He's 1.35 fantasy points per minute over the last 3 games, where Reggie Jackson, even with the uptick, has gone from 0.90 to 1.05 or 1.06. That's a big difference between those guys. So Reggie's finding a ton of value salary based on the other sites. But for this, I'm still going to chase that. Like if these guys are projected out basically even 35.9, 34.9 for CJ and Terry Rozier versus a 37.8 for Reggie in the median, I'm thinking that those other guys have that 50-point upside more frequently. So I'm going to those guys over Reggie. And I think that's the approach that I want to take here. But I don't discount Reggie completely. I don't think it's a bad call.
Makes sense. I understand that. And I think that wraps up the guard position pretty well. Let's bounce over to the forwards now, Tyler. And once again, I think we have tiers at forward.
F, Tyler.
What was that? Yeah. I mean, forward's a tough word to spell. It's F. There's an R in there. We don't really hit the 4. Like we don't really hit that R very hard. So I can see how that one would. Yeah, that would trip up Tyler pretty good as well. But at the forward position, once again, I think we have tiers pretty similar to what we had at guard. Giannis, he's the Luka of the forward position. Then we've got Jimmy Butler. He is he's the LaMelo Ball of the forward spot. But we do have Jimmy Butler's officially listed as questionable. But if you saw before we started, Jimmy Butler reports came out. He's on track to play. No real surprise there. It's a shoulder injury. He was listed as questionable last game, but the same shoulder injury, he played through it. There's no reason to think he wouldn't today. So for all intents and purposes, I consider Jimmy Butler a full go. Same idea. I'm going to ask you the same way. Do you agree Luka is the Giannis and then Jimmy Butler a la LaMelo Ball in terms of tier 1 Giannis, tier 2 Butler, then it's everybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. They line up exactly like that on our projections as I'm looking at them here on the board. I mentioned there's those top 3 options, and then there's this other group of guys in the high 30s and 40s, and Jimmy's the top guy on that list, sitting at 44.8 points of DraftKings projection, topping out slightly over LaMelo at 42. But like you were getting at earlier, there are a few other reasonably good options at the forward position. I think there's a little bit of depth here where we can switch around. Like there's not a massive projection gap between a Jimmy and like a Kyle Kuzma, Brandon Ingram, some of these other guys on the board here. So there's a little bit of room to bounce around.
I don't even know if I should. I have one lineup that's just optimal by such a wide margin for this particular slate. It's all the players we have in right now with Tyler, that Tyler has in on the screen. And then it would just be Joel Embiid at the flex spot and Bam Adebayo at center, assuming that he is center eligible. But to me, that's the lineup that just scores the most fantasy points by like a very wide margin. That's also the one I assume a lot of people are going to figure out is the best overall lineup to play. So let's look at some of these other forward options here. And maybe we want to play Giannis at the flex spot and throw Joel Embiid at the center. So let's dig a little bit more into the forwards, and kind of like how before we talked about CJ McCollum and Reggie Jackson as potential off the board plays. Who are some of the forward options behind Giannis and Jimmy Butler that you think could have a lot of upside that might not be quite as popular for people to roster?
Yeah, so I just mentioned Kuzma. I think, looks good. We've seen upside performances from him over, recent games and over, honestly, the entire course of the season. He's been a lot better than I thought he was for sure. So I think he's on the board here. We've got him projected at 42 DraftKings points. So right in the mix with where we've got Jimmy, a 2-point DraftKings median point projection difference is completely negligible when it really comes down to it. Like that's the same guy to me. So if we wanted to start making pivots around guys like that, now I think Kuzma is going to draw a lot of ownership just because he's talked about on other sites. He's very popular on the other sites. And that's kind of how I would weigh some of these decisions is look at the ownership on some of these guys and try and pick off the one who projects similarly at lower ownership from the other sites. Because if you think about it, most of the ownership is going to float up to these top options. So if you're picking off a guy who's already low owned on the other sites, and I know, salary is a factor over there, but you have to think about how much they're getting talked about and where people are just judging it across the industry. People don't really think it through. So those guys are going to get increasingly less popular on this site as people flock to the other high end options. So a guy like Brandon Ingram, who's sitting on our DraftKings projections at 17.5% owned and a 37.8 projection, that again is relatively the same as a 42-point projection. There's a little bit of a gap there, but the ownership more than makes up for it. So I think you could look to him. You could look to a less popular guy like Miles Bridges, who projects out almost exactly the same. Those two guys are very much the same in my mind here. Even a Tobias Harris is on the board, similarly projected. On DK, he's owned 9% of the time. So you're talking about a really unpopular option over there who on any given slate, I think Harris could hit similar upside to any one of those other options to a Jimmy Butler. Less reliably so, certainly, but I think it's there for him if you wanted to make just that wild ownership pivot. But I 100% agree with that is the lineup, that one that you built before we launched into this, that is by far the most optimal lineup you could play on this slate.
And I want to see, Tyler, could you type in Middleton? I'm pretty sure that he would have forward eligibility here, but he could be a guard. So I'm just kind of curious. Good spelling. So Chris Middleton, by the way, Chris is actually a complicated one. We could get him this Chris. If he wasn't able to get KHRIS, then I wouldn't be able to make fun of him for that. But yeah, Chris Middleton, Chris spells his first name wrong. But I think Middleton is very similar of a forward option to what you said about CJ McCollum at guard. The median projection for Middleton is not going to be quite as good as some of those other guys we've talked about. The ceiling for him to score 50 plus is there. He's not going to do it frequently, but he has that potential. And we've seen some of these games. If you go through his box score on December 22nd against the Kings, he had 53 against Portland just a couple of games ago. That was a game without Giannis, though, but he had 45. Game against Atlanta, middle of January, 55. Game against Charlotte, 58. That was in January 10th. Another game against Charlotte, 54. So we see these upside games from Middleton. And, we have seen him go for 60 plus in the past. The likelihood isn't there, but if you're really trying to differentiate your lineup, I would look at Middleton pretty similarly, like I said, with the CJ play you gave out before. That's the kind of way that I'd be looking to maybe really differentiate it forward. How do you feel about him? And do you like the comparison of him kind of being the McCollum of the forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's right in there. I just didn't get down the list to him. I stopped at Tobias. I didn't go down one more spot to Middleton there. But it's the exact same thing I was saying about like Tobias, Bridges, and Ingram, where they all slot into that place where they're similarly projected. They're all low owned on the other sites. They're all players between, let's say, I'm doing this imperfectly, let's say 1.08 fantasy points per minute and like 1.15. They're all very much the same guy when we take pricing out of the equation and we just can play whichever one we want at the same position. We're just basically hunting for these guys that can hit that 50-point upside, have that solid same median score, and then pick whichever one of them is ranking out as the lowest owned on the other sites. To me, yeah, Middleton fits that mold. He's a little bit more popular than like a Tobias, than like a Miles Bridges, but I think he's not going to be, by virtue of all the ownership getting swept up to those top guys, to Jimmy and to Giannis and so on. I think a lot of these guys are just going to get left behind. So any one of them would work, and Middleton's definitely in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think forwards, once again, it's pretty clear. We've got Giannis at the top, then we've got Jimmy Butler, and then kind of everybody else. Jimmy Butler officially listed as questionable, trending towards playing, but we'll need an update definitively on that later. So if you guys are watching right now, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Later on in the day, we've got the deeper dive, we've got live before lock. We've also got our new betting show, which is locks before lock, which is preceding the live before lock and the deeper dive show. Betting show, we'll be talking about player props for about 30 minutes before those shows start. So let's hit on the centers now. Top projected center, Joel Embiid. Very clear tiers once again at the center position. We have Luka at guard, Giannis at forward, Embiid at center. Now, I guess the question is, which of these three players do you think has the most upside between Luka, Giannis, and Embiid tonight, Terry?
That's a little tricky. I mean, we're talking about guys, Giannis, 1.70 fantasy point per minute player, and Embiid 1.64. It would be between those two for me. Any given slate, one of those guys is going to come out on top. I'm fine saying, it's a total coin toss between those guys, but those are my top two guys, top two performers, top two most likely high scorers. So those are the two guys I would want in that flex spot. And like you were talking about before, I think the answer is Embiid, just based on where Bam ranks out in comparison to some of these other center options.
Yep, that's where I'm at too. Like I said, if I'm building a lineup and I'm trying to make it for the most possible points, it's Embiid in the flex spot, just so then we go with Bam Adebayo at center, because I view Bam Adebayo as being the next highest projected player. If I look at my projections for all the players today, it's Giannis, Luka, Embiid on a tier of their own, but then we've got the secondary guard and forward options, LaMelo and Jimmy Butler, but I have Bam projected for more fantasy points today than both Butler and LaMelo. So this is the easiest way to get all of them in, because if we play if we play Joel Embiid at the center spot, then I can't get exposure to Bam Adebayo just because we can only roster one center. And I'm not looking to play Adebayo in the flex spot either. But let's just say we're doing something really crazy here. We're playing Embiid at the flex. If we're not going to go with Bam Adebayo at center, who is the next center option that stands out to you?
So Christian Wood seems is questionable still, last I saw, and I'm thinking he's probably not going to go. Didn't go last night, created that great value play around Şengün, but that's not really a consideration.
I think he's a forward here, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, is he a forward here?
Yeah.
Sorry, I had him sorted by center value on the on the other sites. All right, so take him off the board. So then we're dropping down to Jonas Valanciunas, and I think that's a major gap. And that's kind of more to the point about that Bam play. It's not even necessarily the difference between like Bam and a CJ. It's the difference between Bam and Joval, Bam and Andre Drummond, and these other center options, that it's just really, really stark in that median projection. Any one of those guys could go off and have a bigger night than Bam. We know that Drummond, for example, is a 1.33 fantasy point per minute player, but even in his extended run, like he gets out to a 23, 26 minute night, and he's not going to cap out. He's very rare. He's going to play like 30 minutes. So just the minutes is going to take Bam up and over him way, way more often than not. So there's just a huge ceiling gap. There's a huge median projection gap that I just don't think it's worth doing that and going to those guys. But those would be my next choices, would be Joval and Andre Drummond.
Yeah. So for me with Drummond, it just kind of becomes a question of how many minutes does he play? Because we saw last night, for instance, Drummond only played 23 minutes against the Knicks. He scored over 40 fantasy points, though. And Drummond, I've had this never-ending debate with people. Drummond is not a particularly good relative to other NBA players. I don't know where this thing is coming from, but all of a sudden, I've started to say Drummond isn't particularly good, and people are like, "Oh yeah, you think you're better than him?" No, that's not the point. When we're talking about players, it's always relative to other players. At no point do I think that I am a better basketball player than Andre Drummond. Far from the case. I don't think Drummond is great relative to other NBA players. As a result, he isn't getting a whole bunch of minutes from the Nets right now, but he's an excellent fantasy producer. And if we do happen to see Drummond play those extended minutes, the ceiling is as high as just about anybody at the center position, because his points per minute production this year, fairly crazy, which it always is. He's playing 18 minutes per game this year, averaging 24 and a half fantasy points. We just need him to get to 30 plus minutes, which is possible because he's been starting for the Nets. Just once again, not all that likely. So I do think that he probably actually is the second most upside at center behind Joel Embiid. Just the downside is pretty significant because we don't know what his playing time is going to be. So
yeah, if you could lock him in for 30 plus minutes, he'd be the answer at number 2 center there. I would probably play him over Bam, and I think that would be an interesting combination. But like you said, I just don't think he gets there. I think his upside is 26 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that's his upside. I think his floor is probably like 18 minutes, but I think there's a chance he plays 30. But either way, low priority play. Yeah. But still somebody at least to consider on a slate that has no salary cap and game style that has no salary cap. So now let's talk about the flex, where if I'm being honest, there's only 3 guys to consider. I'm not playing anybody in the flex other than Joel Embiid, Giannis Antetokounmpo, or Luka Doncic. Just because of positionality, my choice here is Embiid. You seem to agree, but are there any other thoughts you have to offer about the flex spot here?
I just totally agree in terms of it only being those 3 guys. If it's not one of those 3 guys that you're putting in that lineup, you're making a mistake and put somebody and go back and start over. It's just those guys. I agree. It's Embiid, and it's for the reasons that we talked about when we were talking about Bam and how he projects differently as compared to those other centers and those other options that you could potentially put at the other spots. So yeah, I think our construction that we built is the most optimal, and the pivots that we talked about are the ones to look to. There's not really much to talk about in terms of like off the board flyer plays, like on the salary sites. I think a guy like, let's say, Seth Curry for 6,000 on FanDuel, 5,500 on DK could have a lot of utility and a lot of value tonight if he starts, getting hot from 3 and all these different things I would say if we were on live before lock right now. I think he's totally irrelevant on this slate because salary doesn't matter. And if you're putting Seth Curry into your lineup instead of, let's say, LaMelo Ball in one of the guard spots, you are making a mistake on this site. So it's just not worth getting into.
All right. That is going to do it for us today, guys. Once again, no salary cap over on FanUp. Different, fun way to play DFS. Sign up for the first time using that promo code Awesemo. Get $25 in your account, free money. You don't have to do anything. You just sign up, download the app, use the promo code Awesemo, get yourself some money to play with. Don't even have to make a deposit. You're going to like the site, free contests to play, and all different kinds of cool prizes. In addition to cash, they're also giving out shoes, jerseys, all that kind of stuff. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Good luck today, guys.